noted, we have 3 people who can speak. All of them have a lot of international connections in their work. But we're going to invite our 3 first panelists to speak about what's happening in Canada. So we had, as Tim said, a rough period. I think our brothers and sisters from the north will say this rough period has been over decades and hundreds of years. But for many of us in kind of modern civil society or urban civil society, we really felt the brunt over the last 10 years, and that gave rise to initiatives like Voices and others. But now, we have sunny days, a new government, dramatically different tone, if nothing else. And so, so part of what we're doing at Voices, and I just want to point out that there's several people here in the audience, Robert Pearl, and Leilani as well, who are part of the steering committee for Voices. So we want to hear, and we've been thinking a lot about, so now what, right? So our project of documenting these aggressions on dissent and voice was very relevant. We knew why we were doing it during the last period. But now, what's happening now, and how can we continue to support, if relevant, this issue? So it'll be really important to hear from our Canadian speakers, those who have a foot in Canada. What do you think is still the issue? What is the unfinished work? Or what do we do now that we have potentially opportunities to really make significant changes with the new tone in government? So we're going to invite the Canadian panelists to talk about that. And then we're going to invite Maina, who has been in Canada once before. We invited him to a secret clandestine meeting to talk about what was happening in Canada. So he got an overview from different sectors of what was happening 3 years ago. So we're then going to ask him to reflect on what he's hearing and what does this sound like based on what he had captured the last time he was here. And then we're going to kind of round off the conversation asking Leilani, who also wears UN Special Rapporteur hat, and of course Maina, who's had now almost completed his 6-year mandate, to link what they're hearing here and what we're discussing here with what they're seeing elsewhere. How does our Canadian experience relate to other experiences in the North and in the South? What are some interesting, scary, or potentially hopeful things they've observed in their missions overseas around that we might be able to learn from and build on, right? So that's how I'm hoping we can shift the conversation. And I do want you guys to come in, so I will try to keep our part shortish so that we can then have an exchange with you guys as well, okay? So I'm going to start with you, please, to talk about BDS and what you're observing, but based on your perspective, and maximum 2 minutes, this is just an introductory remark, what are you feeling are some of the challenges, key challenges still facing us here in Canada?
Je m'adresse à vous en français vu qu'on est au Québec. C'est la raison. Okay? Le plus gros problème à laquelle on fait face, c'est le pouvoir médiatique qui est tellement puissant qu'on n'a presque pas de voix. Combiné avec l'autocensure idéologique par les gens qui caractère progressiste, qui ont peur de dire les choses comme ils sont. Nous avons un nouveau gouvernement libéral qui suit dans les traces du gouvernement Harper avec leur appui à Israël et la condamnation symbolique de BDS Québec, qui peut nous faire mal parce que la population, pour des raisons que je n'accepte pas, est en amour avec M. Trudeau. Okay? J'ai étudié avec sa mère à l'université et nous avons vécu le père Trudeau qui a dit « Just watch me » quand on a occupé le Québec en 70 et mis tous les intellectuels en prison. Alors on a ce problème-là et les gens ne veulent pas ouvrir les yeux sur les gros problèmes. La souffrance à Gaza, le double standard quand on parle des assassinat en Syrie quand quelqu'un est assassiné en Europe, c'est terrible, ça se fait depuis 5 ans, le Daesh le fait en Syrie, et on n'en parle pas, c'est quand les médias sont contrôlés. On entend parler de Burundi. On parle de génocide au Burundi lorsqu'il n'y en a pas de problème au Burundi. Il y a des assassinats sélectifs par Paul Kagame et le gouvernement du Rwanda, appuyé par les États-Unis. On a peur de parler de l'impérialisme. Et on est en évolution. Nous sommes très optimistes. Je termine avec hier, BDS Québec a assisté à l'Assemblée des actionnaires de la compagnie CAE Inc. Côte de l'Est, nous étions 5. CAE a des contrats avec Israël, contrats d'armement que nous apprenons par leur site web. Nous avons réussi un très bon article dans la presse d'aujourd'hui, qui était en fait électronique hier. Et nous avons une rencontre, je viens tout juste de prendre rendez-vous avec la direction des affaires publiques dans 2 semaines. Et on ne lâchera pas là-dessus. Voilà. Alors, il faut aller saisir toute la communauté et parler clairement et ne pas avoir peur de dire les choses comme ils sont.
Merci. Est-ce que je peux poursuivre un peu? Alors, si je comprends bien, pour résumer, une des problèmes importants que vous voyez toujours, c'est le peur que les gens ont de parler ouvertement sur certains sujets tabous, disons. Est-ce que vous pensez que c'est un nouveau problème? Est-ce que c'est un vieil problème? Je pense que vous avez évoqué le père de Trudeau. Est-ce qu'il y a des circonstances particulières maintenant qui rendent ça toujours un problème? Est-ce que vous pouvez nous essayer de comprendre pourquoi vous pensez que c'est toujours un problème aujourd'hui?
Mais c'est différent maintenant parce qu'on a plus de liberté de parole en papier. Formellement, on a plus de droits de s'exprimer et on ne se fait pas arrêter et on n'est pas mis en prison comme se passe dans beaucoup de pays occidentaux. Ici, nous vivons dans une société assez libérale avec un petit L et grand L aussi. Mais les gens, les gros médias ferment la porte presque tout le temps. Les chefs de pupitre disent non, non, non. Et un sujet que je connais très bien, celui du Burundi, je connais, et du Rwanda. Je vous critique pas, hein? Je mets au défi de comprendre parce que c'est impossible avec les médias ici et je ne vous critique pas quand je dis ça. Alors, il y a un problème de pouvoir terrible des médias. D'ailleurs, c'est du brainwashing qui se fait dans les années 50. Moi, je suis un peu plus vieux que beaucoup parmi vous. Nous, on a entendu les horreurs de la Russie, qui étaient très largement faux. Voilà. Alors, le système de lavage de cerveau est très fort et ça exige la vraie compréhension, la vraie énergie à comprendre et le courage d'aller sortir des sentiers battus. Et chez nous, au BDS, il y a des gens qui disent « mais je ne connais rien de l'Afrique. Et c'est plus facile d'appuyer BDS. » Wow, ça ne marche pas comme ça. On ne peut pas travailler comme ça. Parce que sinon, on devient des Occidentaux blancs qui rejettent l'Afrique, on rejette des gens qui ne sont pas blancs. Et évidemment, l'histoire ne va pas dans ce sens-là. Plutôt, l'avenir appartient aux peuples qui ne sont pas blancs. Et il y en a tant.
Alors, si je comprends bien, vous pensez qu'une des conditions clés qui génère cette peur ou cette étouffe la conversation sur des thèmes comme BDS et l'Israël, c'est le rôle des médias, puis le contrôle des médias. OK, parfait. Merci beaucoup. So Leilani, I'm going to turn to you with your Canadian hat on, Canada Without Poverty. What, in your perspective, from your experience, is one of the most pressing challenges that we have related to dissent today in Canada? Sure. And you can maybe address right away, is it an old challenge? Is it a new challenge? What's different?
Sure. Actually, what I wanted to do, if you don't mind, is talk about two things. I wanted to talk about something that is front and center in terms of my work as the Executive Director of Canada Without Poverty. And then I wanted to just reflect on a personal challenge that I experience, I would say, on a daily basis, and it's not unrelated to what the first speaker just talked about. So the first challenge that I'll put out there is the fact that it is very, very difficult for people living in poverty in this country to advocate for their needs and their human rights. And there's two ways in which barriers have been constructed. The first, I would say, and so this dates us into the early 2000s, around when Stephen Harper was elected Prime Minister, and that was the defunding of organizations across the country, advocacy organizations across the country, and that obviously had an impact on organizations representing the voices of poor people and the experiences of poor people. So that was like the first blow. The second blow, and it actually existed during the Chrétien years as well, and even before that, but really came to the fore, and many of us in this room know what I'm about to talk about, which is the Income Tax Act and the way in which the Income Tax Act governs charities and the ability of charities to do what are deemed political activities. And the way in which this has played itself out, I have heard about it mostly with respect to environmental organizations, but it has had an incredibly detrimental effect on the freedom of expression and freedom of association for people living in poverty. And here's how that works. So most poor people in Canada are struggling to make ends meet, right? Very straightforward, 5 jobs, part-time here, running kids there, a busy life that makes it very difficult to organize and advocate for themselves. So what do? They look to organizations to represent their interests and their human rights. And so they look to organizations like Canada Without Poverty. Canada Without Poverty would not exist without charitable donations. The government of Canada says that charitable organizations or charities can only spend about 10% of their work on what are deemed political activities. People living in poverty tell me, and have been telling my organization for more than 40 years, that in order to relieve poverty in Canada, which is a charitable endeavor to relieve poverty in Canada, we need to change laws, policies, and programs. And that is the way we are going to make sure that 4.9 million people no longer live in poverty, or to ensure that 900,000 people stop having to use food banks each month. And so the people living in poverty say the way to relieve poverty is through systemic change, through what are deemed political activities. And the government says, well, that's nice, but your organization cannot remain charitable if you're going to spend the bulk of your activities doing those things. And so there's a complete disconnect between what the government of Canada is saying and what poor people believe they need in order to live better lives and have their human rights recognized in this country. And so the impact is an organization like Canada has its charitable status questioned, which is in fact the case. We continue to be under review for 4 years of an audit later, and makes it very difficult for us to speak out on behalf of people living in poverty. And so there is an incredible chill effect, obviously. The Canada Revenue Agency that implements the Income Tax Act has said clearly to Canada Without Poverty that 98.5% of our activities are political. And so in order to comply with the Income Tax Act, we would obviously have to decrease those activities by 88.5% or whatever. Obviously, it's not going to happen. So that's the first issue that I put out there. What I would say in terms of what we need to do, I think we need to re-articulate the debate to some degree that's also taking place in the media as a freedom of expression and freedom of assembly argument, and not just an argument about how rules and guidelines are applied. And that's the push my organization has been trying to make. This is a human rights issue, and it's a freedom of expression and assembly and association issue. On the personal side, I am a Canadian of Arab descent, and I would say the biggest barrier, and I wouldn't just put it to the media, although the media is front and center on this one too. I'd say the biggest barrier for me is, and people in my circles, is to be able to articulate a human rights position with respect to the Israel-Palestine position without being deemed and labeled anti-Semitic, racist, hateful, etc. And it manifests in terms of, whether we support the BDS movement, and it manifests in so many ways. And the reason I say it's not just the media, although the media is terrible. I mean, making editorial decisions during the Gaza war in 2014, Operation Dismantle or whatever it was called. The Globe and Mail making an absolute editorial decision that they would not make it front page news, and they would stop covering it after a certain number of days. I mean, really. But I point at the Government of Canada and our sunny ways where our position at the UN has not changed. Canada continues to vote against resolutions that are human rights oriented resolutions. There's no doubt there's politics at play, but these are human rights oriented resolutions, and Canada continues not just to abstain, which was our historical position, but to take a negative position in line with the US and Israel. And so it makes it very difficult. I believe human rights are kind of neutral, right? They're universal. They apply they apply equally to Israelis and Palestinians. And when you see what's happening in that situation, and you name a human rights violation, if you're naming it in the name of Palestinians, you're racist or anti-Semitic. Period. And even if there's an act that is only against the Palestinians and you name that, you are expected to name something that may have happened on the human rights side to Israelis, even where that one incident was absolutely perpetrated only against Palestinians. So for me, that's a huge, it's a personal thing. I carry it with me every day, every time I open a newspaper, every time I
agree with you 100%.
Yeah. And there are governments saying, including the national level government, the government of Ontario, trying to push through anti-BDS legislation. I mean, if that isn't trampling on freedom of expression, what is? Thank you.
Thank you, Leilani. I'm just making notes to myself, but it's interesting because we just had, and I'm looking at Ian, among others, a big review of one of the 128 consultations or whatever that the Canadian government has put out recently on the international development agenda. And of course, we're pushing for a human rights-based approach, which is something that civil society has been harping about globally for decades. But the implications of that are exactly what you're saying, right? That if we are going to have a human rights-based approach to addressing poverty issues in Canada or elsewhere, it is about changing laws and policies and programs, right? And that is political activity, and that kind of blows everything out of the water. So it's an interesting to be followed for sure. It's going to be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, so I want to invite Sylvia to share with us your top issue that you want. I know there's many, but if you can choose one to start the conversation, and we'll make sure we come back to the others after. And I believe you have some images that you're going to show us as well.
The fact that our lands have been stolen and no one wants to talk about that is that big elephant in the room. Translator the very fact that the French have a translator, the English can speak their language. I speak English, but the big Sweden, big schoon. I have no translator to tell you what I say, right? Don't you ever wonder why there's two official languages and the Indigenous languages are not even in the periphery? Don't you ever wonder, question those very things. That's the silence. That's the very thing that is not talked about here, the genocide of Indigenous people. 90 to 98% of my people were wiped out when your people came here, right? Those are the kind of things that you are not going to be taught in these colonial educational systems. And I have benefited. I wouldn't be sitting here speaking your language if it hadn't been for my education within the colonial system, but I've suffered as a result of it because I now know what racism is, because growing up in my community, I didn't. I was very well loved and nurtured. I was one of the hidden children. Just one of when the Indian agent and the priests came for the children, my grandparents were hidden, my mother and father were hidden, and I was hidden. That's how come I can sit here and speak in my language. See, that's one of the reasons. And this is what is silenced so much. And for me to keep saying it in this day and age, that my people are still fighting for their liberation, their freedom, and self-determination on our own lands, that we're still doing that in this day and age. All of you are outraged about the atrocities happening globally, and yet these very things are happening here. The ethnocide that's happening, the genocide that continues to happen. Do you not recognize your privilege? Do you not recognize it, that you benefit from my people's poverty? You need to talk about that and recognize that and speak about that openly. Because if you do not, my people are going to continue to live in poverty. They're going to continue to die. You see my people at that bus stop over there? They wouldn't be in that situation if our lands were given back. But this government will not give it back as long as the doctrine of discovery continues to be utilized in every court case. We keep winning, but those victories are never recognized on the ground, and I'll show you why. We keep hearing about all the Indigenous people, land, and all these different things. These are my people's lands. If you turn around, how do you diminish the lights a little bit? Things right there. These are my people's lands. Those are all of our trees. They're moving in. These are my dad's hunting lands that have been in our family for generations, for thousands of years, 500,000 of years. They started putting gates on the roads that lead to hunting lands. That's why I was having a hard time to come here. They do that even as I stand here telling you. You enjoy your democracy, you enjoy your equality, I don't have it. With the Indian Act in place, the Indian Act birthed the apartheid in Africa. Yet we're outraged about that, and yet it's still here. It's still here. And I don't see a difference. In fact, since the Liberal government has come into power, the extraction of resources has been incredibly crazy. It's gone crazy. It's like a land grab in my people's lands. I am a lawyer. I cannot even trust to take this issue into your colonial courts. And that's the big elephant again in the room. I have to go to the landfill and go get the boards and put them there to try and stop the clear cutting. Because I don't have the money. Do you know how incredibly expensive it is to utilize the colonizer's court? It's crazy. I've got my friends helping me, my family. Most of my people are afraid to go out there. They're afraid of your system. We've been a brunt of it for so long. There we are, putting up signs again. That's the damage that's happening right now. Right now. Where's the logging going while my people are living homeless? I'm homeless. I am homeless. Picture that. Yet the trees are paying for the maintenance and operations of the hospitals, the legislative buildings that you are enjoying and benefiting from. I do not consider myself Canadian. I've never declared myself a Canadian. I do not identify as a Canadian because I've never benefited from them, despite the lies that this government and the media continues to tell to you that we get free things. I want to see those free things because I'll give them back to get my lands back. You can have them back. You want your education system back? Take it. This is what's happening right now. I don't have time to be nice anymore. I used to be able to say it very nicely and diplomatically. I can't anymore. This is called environmental racism. This is ethnocide. Who am I without the trees, the animals that I need to nourish me because I can't stand your people's food? There's some things like chocolate and coffee. But most of the time, I have a hard time with the food. It doesn't go well with my system. I need the food of my people. So this is what's happening. That's the reality of my situation here in the stolen lands through the doctrine of Christian discovery. When John Cabot or John Cabot or Jacques Cartier came here and put that sword in the soil and the presumed sovereignty of the crown crystallized. Now I'm talking legalese here. But question where this government asserts title, what gives them that jurisdiction? It's the doctrine of discovery. Every time we've gone to court, this government, the laws have asserted the doctrine of discovery, except they don't want to call it that because it's totally absurd. It's absurd. They call it the underlying title of the crown. That's what they call it. They want to pretty it up. But if you put whipped cream on poop, it's still poop, right? If I were to go to you right now and I said, I have fairy dust, only I can see it, but I want you to believe I have fairy dust, and it has the power to give me jurisdiction over your lands. That's what the doctrine of discovery is. It came from the imagination of a pope in your people's lands, and it was brought here and caused devastation that is still felt every day in my life. My children, I've been born into a prison system called the Indian Act. My children have been born into it. My grandchildren are born into it. So I'm still fighting for the freedom and liberation of my people. That's where it is. That's where it's at. So think about your privilege. Think about the languages that we speak here today. So thank you for giving me the floor and giving me your patience and your mind and listening. I thank every one of you. May the Creator bless every one of you, and I symbolically shake hands for your listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you. Can I ask you to, we'll ask our other guests to come back. I just wanted to help us explore the challenge that you're putting to us a little bit more. I'm wondering if you can speak to the potential, the different discourse. I think we can agree that there is a different discourse from the current government, and how deep or broad that's going to be is a huge question mark. I think you're questioning it very much, rightfully so. But you know, the commitment to implement all the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you know, to establish a new relationship, a nation-to-nation relationship. I mean, all these commitments that are being made. Do you see? What would you suggest would be the strategy to get something out of that? And is there a role that, you know, other Canadians could play, or Canadians can play to support that? What would be, you know, I'm sure it's a complicated, lengthy conversation, but if you could kind of pinpoint something where you think, given this, you know, discourse of openness and wanting to turn the page and do things differently, what would be the place to start, perhaps, trying to get something concrete out of that, to really start making the profound changes that you're saying need to happen to really address the issues?
What is nation to nation? It sounds like a beautiful language. Is it Nation to Indian Act? Right? Canada is not a nation. It's a colonial state. That's a misrepresentation to say Canada is a nation. Right, let's be clear about that first. Canada is a colonial state, and it's on stolen lands. The very first step, if you want to authentically work with Indigenous people, abolish the doctrine of discovery. Get rid of it. And then what's the next step? My people have laws. We have laws. We're very much nations. We have laws, and I wrote about them. Read my book, Nationhood Interrupted. Go in and read it, because I know very much about your laws. I went in and learned them. Learn ours, right? Learn them. Because I know very well the injustice and the corruption of your governments. And I'm not saying that the Trudeau government is corrupt, but it's based on very much on a very corrupt system, and that's the doctrine of discovery, and that's where it's working from, the apparatuses of it, right? And it's going to continue in that direction if we don't work towards abolishing the doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery is the reason why the destruction is happening out on the land, because they use an eminent domain, right? Easement to go into our lands. They can do this without our consent. You're seeing the doctrine of discovery unfolding. They don't need our consent, even though we've been there for 500,000 years. So abolish it. Make a commitment to abolish the doctrine of discovery, right? Give back our lands. If you're unable to give back our lands, then what is the alternative? And now I'm going back into legalese here, eh? What is the alternative? Compensation, reparation, so that people like me, even though I have a law degree, are not homeless, that are not jobless. We are led to believe that if we go into law school, if we get educated in the colonial system, we are going to be taken care of. But what do we lose in the end? Because I don't have a job, and I certainly don't have a home right now. So there's this illusion that if you get an education, you be a good Indian, you're going to benefit. But that's all an illusion, I'm telling you right now. See, I would rather have the lands back. There are treaty commitments that are continually violated, even by the Trudeau government. repeal Bill C-45. I haven't seen that repealed. That's the whole reason why I Don't Know More began. It removed the protection of the waters. I am barely able to protect one water stream right now. My best friend Sean knows this. He came out to my people's land. They're going to clear cut across the road from the fresh water stream, and I have to go home. I may even have to tie myself to a tree to do it. See, that's what it's come down to. And if you're asking if there's a difference with a Liberal government, no. At this point, I don't see them. They made a commitment to repeal those bills, and they have not. The clear cutting violates Treaty 6, the treaty terms and promises for hunting, fishing, and gathering. Where are we to fish, gather, and hunt if there are no trees and no animals? No one spoke to us. So to me, abolish the doctrine of discovery and honor the treaty terms and promises. Right? I don't think I'm asking for much. I want some of that freedom, that liberation in your democracy, because I sure don't see it, and I've never seen it.
Thank you, Sylvia. So, Maina. So you've heard what I'm hearing, and I want to hear what you're hearing, of being reminded of the profound nature of these issues, right? That they're like, we really want to address them. We have to dig so deeply. So I'm really curious, first of all, to hear. So what is this saying to you? You were here 3 years ago. You heard a lot that time. We sat you for a whole day and bombarded you with all kinds of labor sector and First Nations and poverty groups and international development groups, all telling you what was happening. So from this set of issues that you've heard this morning, what reflections you're having, and then maybe you could go into comparing with what you're observing elsewhere, and is this a unique experience? Is this what everybody else is facing? Different, similar? It'd be interesting, I think, for all of us to hear. And just to, I'm not sure if maybe because of the translation, but I'm not sure you said that. As clearly as it is in my mind, that when the Trudeau government took power, shortly thereafter, one of the first things we saw coming out of Parliament was this condemnation of any organization or person who supports BDS. And every Liberal MP that was in the room voted for it. It was a Conservative motion, but every single. And so that was such a shocking slap in the face, right, for a government that had campaigned on this, we're going to change the tone, we're going to roll back on all the suppression of dissent, basically. They had their own language, but it was talking to that. And then that's the first thing that we see happen in Parliament. So, so there's that, and then of course the issue of First Nations communities that they've been facing for hundreds of years. I think we're hearing from Sylvia that it's not enough just to change the tone to address the profound nature of that crisis. And then Leilani talking about the clashes between our legal system, our colonial legal system, and some of the important advocacy policy work that needs to be done to address things like poverty and others. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be back in Canada. And I'm sorry as well if I'm a bit stuffy. I'm just trying to recover from a bad cold that caught up with me earlier this week. But it's just interesting to be back here. It's one of the things that came up is that when I was last here, I tried to get what we call an official visit to Canada, so I could come and have a chance to look and officially meet with government delegations and government people. And it was one of the most one of the most interesting experiences I've had as a special rapporteur, which is that I wrote to the government through the mission in Geneva. I got no response, so I called them up and had a meeting, and they said, well, thank you for your letter, we're going to consider inviting you. So I tried to push them a bit and said, so when can I expect that? I've got some dates here, will this work? And they said, eventually at the end of the meeting, they said, well, actually, you've got to wait for the others who have applied, who want to come before you, and you're 10th on the list, which basically means you'll never get invited. And so I kept pushing and pushing, and I think one of my most interesting, actually the most interesting meeting I've ever had as the most volatile and most tense meeting I've ever had as Special Rapporteur was with a Canadian representative to Geneva, a certain Miss Elisa Goldberg was the permanent representative of Canada to Geneva. I have been to many places. I've been to Malaysia, I've been to Cambodia, I've been to Kazakhstan, I've been to Rwanda. I have never had a more tense meeting in my life than I had as Special Rapporteur than I had with the Canadian PAM rep in Geneva. And it was a meeting where I came in with my team, and the first thing she said to us was, I see you've come with a supporting cast. And that just laid the tone of the meeting. So she sat there with her team of people, and I sat this way. And it's all about something I'd done in a report where I included Canada. And she was trying to get me to say that I should never write about Canada without reference to them first. And this is a thematic report rather than a country report. And I completely refused, so it was tense. It was so bad, she was shaking. She was sitting with me, and her hands were shaking. It was a really tense discussion. At the end of the day, I said, look, this is about that. It won't happen, so let me go. She says, okay, now let's calm down. And then she asked me, so let's now talk about your mandate. What are you planning to do? Are you planning to go? I said, are you normal? You know, we've had this discussion about a very tense issue. Now you want us to have a normal conversation? I'm sorry, I don't need your input. I don't need it. And that was the last time I saw her. Next thing I heard, she had been promoted and is now in Ottawa somewhere, doing very well, apparently working with partnerships and civil society. So I've had a very interesting view of Canada since, at least the official view, and that was the Harper government. And I thought that, you know, I think, of course, one of the things that Canada is so good at, and it was quite good during the Harper regime as well. Canada is good at selling itself. And the image of Canada is always this nice, soft, good people, gentle, you know. But I think the Harper regime, towards its end, began destroying that. And I think there was a lot of disconnect between what Canada was selling itself as and what was happening. So now, when I look back and I see what's happening, so I think a lot of us were quite pleased that there was a new breath of life. And the way I put it as Special Rapporteur is that democracy, which is one of the things I look at in Freedom of Association and Assembly, democracy demands change of regimes. It's good. And once the change of regimes, then you can have more space or less space. It's a good thing when people can assemble and associate. So I use democracy as a tool in that sense. So I was pleased, both officially and unofficially, with the change in Canada. But of course, I think to expect anything to happen, I think when you look at experiences, I hope you don't mind if I merge the two as often as I can. When you look at experiences across the world, once the change of government, the role of civil society is to strike as fast and as early and as hard as possible. You may be happy with the change, and you should be happy with the change. But if you let it, if you revel in the moment for too long, it'll be too late. Because politicians have many constituencies. We're only one of them. Human rights is only one part of a broad agenda that politicians have. And I think one of the things I've learned over the last 5 years is that we think in human rights that our agenda is the most important. And it's good for us to think about it. That's why we're working in it. I mean, if you didn't think that, it would be silly. But it's not the only one. And there's many other things, many other demands that go on with the government, with politicians. Our job is to make sure that as we revel and as we celebrate, we also go for these guys as fast and as hard as we can. So it's great to see all those things that are happening, the human rights, all these changes, Indigenous people's respect and other things. But I think it's crucial that we do not relent. Otherwise, the space will close before you know it. The corporates will come in, other things will come up, and before you know it, we are marginalized. And we have seen this in many, many countries around the world when there's a change of government. We don't strike when the iron is hot. It's almost a demand on us, almost like the new governments, which we support in some form, expect us to give them a honeymoon time. What we just saw now here is that the corporates are clever. They see the change and they realize this might not last very long, so let's intensify. And that's what they do. They intensify. It gets worse because they're seeing it won't be as easy as before. And while on our side we're looking and saying, oh well, we're happy. He's saying the right things, but we've got to move faster. I think that's one of the things. The second The second thing which I'm now beginning to understand more and more, and I think partly because of of the work I've been doing, is the role of the corporate sector and big business and small business within this. I think the last 20, 30 years has really risen, has really shown up business as the core actor in life. Whatever we want to look at, whether it's political life, economic life, social life, and nobody has benefited from globalization as much as businesses. We knew that was going to happen. I think anybody who analyzed globalization could see it was going to happen. What we have not done well, and that happens everywhere, is that we didn't put enough roadblocks, if you wish, obstacles to also raise other people. Now, we may or may not like business. I think that's each individual's choice. But I think one of the things that we have got to have is a way that if some people are getting wealthier, then others should also do so. It can't be that only one side is getting wealthier and everybody else getting poorer. It's not good business. I mean, for any businessman will tell you, it's not good business if only some are making money and the rest are not. So there's a whole set of work that we have to do in looking at the corporate side and understanding how we can push that a little bit more. So I think we have to have new targets. And I think that's what I'm hearing now in Canada with all this logging, with all the Indigenous people's rights, new targets that move. And that also applies to the BDS. And I just came from a mission in the US, which is a very long mission. And it's the first time I actually heard of the BDS in that form as it was. And in the context of New York State, where the governor has issued an executive decree that anybody who's working on BDS will not have any links with the New York State government. And now that's the first, I've never seen a more frontal assault on association than that from a state government. You know? So there's work here, and I know, I'm sure Leilani will confirm that within, at least for me, within the UN system, the two countries that seem to have run roughshod over every aspect of human rights is Israel and China. Not even Russia. Russia gets, there's a focus on Russia. Russia doesn't get much away with anything. There's a lot of attacks on Russia. China is very difficult. China, and this also happens within the UN system itself, within the staff at the UN, at OHCHR. They're very nervous when you come up and say, I've just seen this thing about Israel, could you please do a communication? And all of a sudden, you're going to run through hoops about it. Partly because the Israeli government, the Israeli regime attacks like nobody else. You do anything on Israel, they come at you, and they come at you at different levels. So much so that people are very scared. They also have NGOs that they use and work with you, and quite a lot of rapporteurs have borne the brunt of attacks by these NGOs against rapporteurs because of talking about Israel. So there's something as well, I think, there we all have to look at in terms of the BDS and how do we deal with it. It just seems to me, and I was very struck, Leilani, by your figure of 4.9 million people in Canada who are living in poverty. I mean, it's the same thing, again, as I'm hearing as well across my mission in the US, the poverty levels, how easy it is to not be poor one day and then a week later you actually homeless. It's striking. The social systems don't exist where you can go around and how easy it is, and I don't know about it is in Canada, but in the US, how easy it is to fall foul of the criminal justice system for something as small as insulting a police officer. And I tell you, you think that just being tough with a police officer is a normal thing if they're harassing you, but in the US, you can end up in jail or you end up with a record anyway, so quickly. And I don't know about Canada, but the same. But the discretion the police have got in the US is striking, and that leads then to a lot of once you get a record, you're finished. I mean, you're almost finished. So the poor people are always getting harassed. One lesson I took out from the US, I went to New Orleans after Katrina, and talked to a number of the communities there. One of the lessons, or maybe it's something you all might want to learn, is linking up these struggles together, whether it is the Indigenous people's struggles, the anti-poverty struggles, the other human rights struggles, and I think this idea that there's an international focus and then a domestic focus, I think the things have to go together. I think it doesn't make sense to me that people here will focus exclusively on international and not focus what's going on in Canada. Your credibility rests upon doing stuff in Canada. I mean, for those of us who are outside, we respect you if you're working on the issues in Canada. So you've got to work on those, and it's not an either-or situation in my mind. I mean, you can walk and chew gum at the same time, I expect, even in Canada. So it can be done. So it can be done. I think that's an important part of it. But also joining the struggles. And one of the interesting parts was after Katrina in New Orleans, when they were rebuilding and reconstructing, one of the fascinating things that a lot of the black population had been pushed out, but some still remained. But as they were reconstructing, and these were construction companies paid for by the federal government, they were not using the black people left behind, or those who wanted to work their work. They were actually importing workers from El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico, and other countries. And it was a distinct plan to kick out and reduce the black population in New Orleans and get a new population. And there was tension like crazy between the new immigrants and now the black population. Slowly, this disconnect is being bridged. There's now beginnings of relations between black and brown, as they call it, black and brown. And people will begin to work together, understanding that the blacks are understanding the enemy is not the immigrants who are looking for a job. It is the people who are bringing them. And how then do you link that and work better? And some of those stories are wonderful. I mean, I think a lot of the undocumented people in New Orleans are now standing up as well, and they begin to protest in a way that's been fascinating. I was asking her what they have a slogan when they go to protest, and they say, "No papers, no fear," and they just say, "Arrest us if you want, deport us if you want, but we're going to protest because their rights don't finish at the border. And you have your rights whether you've got papers or not, and you can assemble and you can protest." So just thinking through this and thinking about Canada, I think you have a golden chance. I mean, I think you have a chance now to start working harder on these issues that are domestic, but also keeping your international stuff going. And the whole defunding thing hasn't changed, has it? On the defunding. And Canada is no longer a player at the international level in terms of human rights and funding for human rights as it used to be. Nobody I know now across the world ever bothers to go to talk to Canadians because why? They won't fund any human rights or democracy work anymore. They're funding trade. So there's places where Canada's history is still surviving, but I think then the bubble is busting and has bust. I think that's one of the things that's there. And the stigmatization is a consistent thing. I mean, I think right across the world, and again, the Rwandans, the Israelis are very good at stigmatizing you, that if you are this, then you're an enemy, and if you say this, you're an enemy. It's almost as though there's only two choices. If you speak about abuses in Israel, then you must be pro-Palestine. No, you might be. You don't have to be. I'm not so sure, Leilani, that human rights are neutral, but at least human rights should be universal. I'm not sure they're neutral. And I think for us, and the challenge, I suppose, for Indigenous people here, is if we're going to work within the international human rights system, then we have basically agreed to work in a certain manner that is not revolutionary. It's a matter of getting small gains as you get there. If we don't want to work within the international human rights system, and we could not, then we've got to take a whole different approach that does not include treaties. It's a different approach entirely, which has been done by many people. I think it's been there. We might have our views about it, but I think if you're working within the international human rights system, as those of us here have basically agreed to do, then we're working to get small victories in small ways as we move forward. I think that's the challenge we've got. Is that useful? I think that's for us to ask the question, whether this is the best way to actually create the change we want, or we're going to go through a different system, a different approach that has a revolutionary approach. That's what we want to go. And whether we can carry the hearts and minds of people. Because of course there is revolution as the Russians did in 1917 with a few people, and then maybe try to make it a big thing, or this revolution that's small, it's much smaller. So we've got to figure out what we want to do. But I think that if we are trying to do non-violent ways, then we have got to be, and want to use the international human rights system, then we've got to work through progressive steps and agree that let's use the system as it is, change the laws if we have to, and pushing those laws I think is crucial. I think it's an important thing, and those are the quick wins. And as you said, the Indian Act and what's there, it's an easy win if you could get rid of it, and I think it'll help a lot of us to move forward. But thank you, and thank you very much for your testimonies. it was fascinating. It's just so good. I come from a country that also was colonized by the English, and as you're seeing now, people are beginning to try and get free of the English. The Scots are almost there, and so we're hoping they get there soon. And so perhaps this finally the great English empire is probably going to collapse at some point. They had a lot of impact from India to Africa to UK itself. We've had a lot of impact. Palestine have been very, very powerful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maina. We're going to go to the floor in a second and get you guys involved in the conversation. But I just want to follow up with the point that you're making, one of the points that you're making, Maina, about how we have to bridge these things, right? And it's challenging, it's difficult, but I think a lot of us are thinking about that and realizing that we need to be doing that in different ways, both between issues, but also linking the global with the domestic, the international with the domestic. And I just wanted to go back because Sylvia, yesterday in another session, you were comparing the amounts of investment from government in the education of children in Ontario, Quebec, and on reserves. And Leilani, in your work on poverty, you've been looking, I'm sure, at of those numbers of poor and those who go to food banks, what percentage are Indigenous people, First Nations, and what are the other groups that are there, and what other issues, what's the story behind that, and how does that help us link some of these issues? So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit to that. So maybe I'll start with you, Sylvia. Just if you could remind us of those figures and maybe others where you see that we have this inequality, which is very tangible and alive in Canada. And do you see that when you're talking about your homeless, you're feeling or being homeless, do you see the link to other homeless people in Canada? Is there something that we can work on together, as across issues, or I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm houseless, right? There's a difference. I'm not homeless. I have several shelters that I go to on the land, right? Recently, back in October, I ran for Indian Act Chief. One of the symptoms of colonization is the patriarchy and the misogyny. And the women are shaking their heads here. I know the white women have experienced patriarchy, and other women in general. We all know patriarchy and misogyny, right? Well, add fire to it within the Indian Act system. When I ran for chief, I was told in a language, they told me, they said, women don't belong in leadership. You need to go home and make bannock. I'm one of the higher educated women from my community, and that's what I was told. So, I'm not a politician. I'm not. But I've watched TV when I had TV before, and I've seen politicians go door to door, right? So I thought I would go door to door. Even in my community, even in my own community, we no longer visit each other. There are such divisions, very much created by the church. We have people that go to church. We have people who are traditionalists. We have people that are Anglican, Catholic, Protestant, all these different, and it causes all kinds of divisions. So when I was going door to door, I found this man who had been homeless. He had dug a hole. Sorry, I'm taking up time. He dug a hole in the ground, put some boards together like a shanty. I have images of that, and I wish I brought it with me, but anyway, I told him even if I didn't get in for chief, and I knew I wasn't going to, but I needed the platform to shake up some of that patriarchy. And the next day when I didn't get in for chief, I took this to Idle No More, to our Idle No More group, and I said, we have to do something. It's part of my people's laws that we don't walk away. So we started a campaign called One House, Many Nations. It wasn't just targeted for Indigenous people, but we took this gentleman and we purposely kept him anonymous because he's the face of millions of people. So we reached out, and then Mini Homes of Manitoba, Daryl and Anita came forward and they said, give us the money, we'll volunteer our time, and we'll give them a home. So we fundraised $25,000 and we made him a mini home that's off the grid, self-sufficient, sustainable. His wood burning stove can generate electricity. So I no longer believe anyone who tells me we can't live without electricity. We absolutely can. I've seen it. We built it. So now I'm working towards having my own mini home off the grid, you know, wood stove, similar to the one that we had built. I'm working towards that, but my most important target right now is to file an injunction. So we're fundraising for that. And anyway, we're working on that. And the biggest thing that I can leave you with today is please find out what the doctrine of discovery is. I also want to leave you with a video to watch. It's on YouTube. It's called Schooling the World, the White Man's Last Burden. And it talks about your education system, the roots and the history of it, and it's totally all connected to the doctrine of discovery and how your education produces docile, submissive subjects of the state, right? So I want to leave you with that bit of homework to go and explore those very things, because they've created a paradigm shift for me. So I have hope. I don't want to totally leave you with this doom and gloom, but I want to invite you all to come to my people's land, to drink the water that comes from deep in the earth and flows over the land. Something in Sean, my best friend Sean says, something natural has become unnatural. We've become so dependent on turning the tap and the water flows. It's natural for us to drink from the water, but we can't anymore. The water's so contaminated. But there's this water stream that my people still drink from, and it's beautiful, it's cold, and it's fresh. And we share that water stream with the little people, not just the animals and different, but it's connected to the spirit world as well. So I invite all of you to come and see that.
Thank you, Susan. Maina, do you want to
Sure.
a little bit about, or any other reactions?
Sure. I mean, on the issue of who's poor in Canada, and I threw out the 4.9 million. I mean, we heard from Sylvia, and of course, it's absolutely true that the poorest people in this country the poorest people in this country are Indigenous peoples. No doubt about it. But Sylvia explained. I don't need to explain. It's the kind of poverty and the roots of that poverty that are actually different than other poverty in Canada. The obliterative nature of the poverty experienced by Indigenous peoples, obliterative of them as a peoples, of their culture, it has to be understood differently than when we're talking about precarious employment that leads to poverty, or even like violence against women that then leads to poverty. It's all of it's important. All of it has human rights repercussions. But I think we have to recognize the qualitative difference. And when you're dealing with such entrenched systemic discrimination, colonization, etc., then the approach is going to necessarily have to be somewhat different, in my opinion. So I just put that out there. One thing I would just say and reflect on my experiences as rapporteur for the last 2 years, a couple of things. The experience of Indigenous peoples in Canada is absolutely replicated across the world in horrific ways. I know Shivani is here, and she can speak to what's happening in India I can tell you throughout Latin America, this is happening. The complete exploitation of peoples and their resources and the whatever you want to call it. In my world, we call it a homelessness, but home, you know, you have to blow open the understanding of what home means. I see it again and again. It is probably the issue that is most brought to my attention by groups across the world, to be honest. And one of the things that's really horrific that I'm seeing, we saw it in Honduras in a very public way, but I see it in other places, and maybe Shivani will talk about this in India, which is when Indigenous and other people try to defend their lands, the repercussions are the worst, and their right to life is absolutely threatened. And as I said, we saw it in a public way in Honduras, but it's happening in many, many, many countries. And human rights defenders, all human rights defenders across the world are being subject to horrific acts. But I'm seeing it particularly where economic and social interests are trying to be protected. And this goes to Maina's comments about the corporates and the power of the corporates. The other thing, just an add-on I wanted to say, is one of the things I haven't seen as I've traveled internationally is, their charitable laws are different in every country, and there's lots of clamping down on NGOs who receive international monies, for example. That's an international phenomenon. It is a way to shut down human rights work, etc. I have not yet encountered anywhere other than Canada a kind of prohibition on advocacy in the way that Canada's doing it, like to say if you're doing X amount of political work to end poverty, that is contrary to charitable laws. In a way, I mean, it may be, but I haven't encountered it where it's stymied organizations or has resulted in a chill in anti-poverty activities. Everywhere I go, and all the governments I've met admit that poverty is a systemic issue that requires systemic responses. And so how that gets meted out in charitable laws in different countries, I don't know always. That's not always, it hasn't been brought to my attention, put it that way. It seems to be, Canada's an outlier in a number of areas, and this is one of the areas along with the Israel-Palestine. There's many, actually, ways in which we are outliers. Canada's a real outlier with economic, social, and cultural rights. The rest of the world has recognized economic, social, and cultural rights are, one, human rights, and two, are justiciable. But Canada is really firm in its anti-economic, social, and cultural rights position. We may see, as you say, golden opportunities. We may see some movement with this government because this government is hell-bent on getting back on the Security Council. And that's one thing that is absolutely certain. Talk to anyone in foreign affairs. They want to get on the Security Council. So that, to me, is our big leverage where human rights are concerned. Because if we start painting and showing how tarnished their human rights reputation is, that will affect their ability to, could affect their ability to get on the Security Council.
Can I just just to add, that perhaps the closest to that Income Tax Act is in the UK.
Yes.
Unsurprisingly, with the Lobbying Act that was passed a year or so ago, for the 6 months before the election. So it's an Anglo system which is trying to make sure that, and I never understand it as well, because the idea of what is political and what's not, and if you use a human rights lens, then actually everything that you do is political. When you're advocating for housing, it's a political act.
Yeah.
So everything that anybody does, even if you're doing service delivery, it is very political, because you decide to do service delivery for a certain community and not another. So there's not a single thing that's not political. So I suppose that, and that's one of the things that I think the Harper government did not want to have brought up. But it's an issue to bring up again, and I'll be happy to continue raising that issue. Maybe I should write a letter to the government about that now in terms of that issue. It's a good issue. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to protect an hour, and we're exactly at the hour, but before we go to the floor, I want to invite John to
I'd just
make
like to
some additional
say
comments.
one thing about what you're saying. Canada maintains the status of the Jewish National Fund as a charitable organization, which is immensely political, and it's a striking, unjust situation compared to what you're talking about.
Jewish National Fund.
Yeah, and that's something which.
There was a very interesting debate at the Green Party convention
Yes,
last weekend about
Well,
this.
we
Yeah.
followed that closely and the recognition.
Yeah.
You can see it on the internet. There's a lot of interesting stuff about the Green. But anyway, this might be kind of thing that we can talk about.